Well, good afternoon and welcome to something that we've been dying to run, which is in the days before Brexit, supposedly the financial services industry was shopped or sent downriver in favor of the British fishing industry. And so we thought we would compare the finance and the fishing industry post-Brexit. And we're delighted to have a dear friend and expert on the subject, Caroline Bennett, here to talk to us today. Now, we've styled this as a community chest, and those of you who know our formats will know that community chest is where we're a little bit friendlier and funnier and like to explore some of the personality of the individual as well as just the techniques of the subject. And the reason for that today is, as Caroline says, both of us are struggling to figure out, is there anything to learn between the two industries? But Caroline does have a short presentation as well on some really interesting facts about the sector. But I'm also anticipating many comments and questions from you, our audience, who are always good at giving those good, incisive questions that get us to the point. So this next slide shows the agenda today. We'll cover our guest, and then Caroline's going to talk about ethical fisheries. Then we're going to have a big question and answer discussion, and then Caroline's going to give you her ask. What should you be doing if you really care about the subject of fisheries? Now, we've seen quite a bit in the press over many, many years, most recently in the green room that we have before these, when we're warming up, we were chatting about Seaspiracy, a Netflix so-called documentary that came out about 2 years ago, which is of dubious quality as a documentary, but certainly raised yet again awareness amongst people about the state of the oceans, fisheries, large marine mammals, etc. But let's see, let's test you on a quick knowledge question. So we have a little poll question here for you, which Peter is just launching. And it's really, what is the closest market comparator to the UK's fishing industry? So looking at these as markets and size, is the UK's fishing industry about the size of the UK's strawberry production, the hairdresser and personal care salon market, the UK lawnmower market, or the UK potato production market? So answers on a web screen, please. As ever, Caroline, our audience is very fast and very opinionated, and 2/3 of them have voted. We'll leave it open for just a few more seconds while the last of you make up your mind. And we're going to close that poll with virtually everyone having voted and see the answers. And the answer is, so far as our audience is concerned, the closest is the UK lawnmower market, followed quite closely by UK potato production. And now, if Peter doesn't mind, the reveal. And well done, audience. Second most popular was UK potato production. Yes, the UK fisheries market is less than £1 billion and about the size of potato production. Lawnmowers, I'm afraid, do win out. Our gardening proclivities are about double the size. Hairdressers and personal salons at 8.6 billion, well produced, and UK strawberry production is about 1/3 of the sector. So an interesting start there to it, and well done, audience. That's impressive. So we get to now, I think, over to you, Caroline, for just some real background work on fisheries themselves.
Sure. Thanks for the introduction, Michael. Well, I mean, yeah, how much detail and how long have we got to talk about fisheries? Hey, Michael, it's such a big subject, isn't it? But yeah, top figures there. You've got 4,300 active vessels in the UK, and I focus very much on the under 10 meters, which is the sector that DEFRA define as the small scale, and of which of the 4,300, about 61% are under 10. That's a UK-wide, but if you look to English and Welsh only, so Scottish is quite a different category of fish. So many puns could be said on these things, but there you go. It's closer to sort of 72, 75%. So many more small boats in the English and the Welsh waters. Then you've got the number of fishers working on vessels, and about 12,000 there. If you look at the multiplier effect, though, so not all fishers are equal. If you can look at it from a multiplier effect on economies locally, so there's potential for a fisher based on a small-scale vessel to come home and spend 100% of his earnings in the pub that evening as he lands. whereas some of the pelagic vessels, particularly in Scotland, where a number of them actually are potentially coming under the slave banner. That there's a report that might come out towards the end of this year, actually, which is currently not out to the public, but there's an awful lot of potential slave vessels that land to supermarkets as well. So it's not just sort of for export market and that kind of thing. And of course, they don't have, or they have virtually no economic multiplier effect locally if they're working offshore for the vast majority of the time. So of that 12,000, the small scale vessels from an economic point of view will bring in much more money into the UK industry if they're working on the under 10 meters. And then you've got the 623,000 tons of fish landed and the top species. And if I look at those, mackerel, herring, blue whiting, haddock, cod, virtually none of those get caught in the Plymouth Sound. So they are all industrial trawl caught fish for the most part. And the vast majority of those would be caught by the Scottish pelagic trawlers. I'll talk a bit about quota and that kind of thing a little bit later on, but cod, for example, in the southwest, the entire quota for the UK, there's only 4% of it catchable in the southwest, and the French down here own about 86, and there are other flag states that own the rest of it. So you can see that even when cod is available to catch, the British don't have the quota to actually go out and target it. So yes, big differences there in the numbers landed. And then if you look at the values, 2019 to 2020, there was a 16% decrease in value for slightly higher tonnage. This, I'd be really curious to see what happens in 2021 and 2022, because pretty much post, because this doesn't really see Brexit or COVID, but since Brexit and since COVID, prices have gone relentlessly up. And I know that's really boring now, but it happened in fish first. It was happening right since Brexit, and nobody could work it out because we all thought that all the fish from the southwest was going to Europe, and indeed it was. So we expected and anticipated a sharp decrease in price, which at the beginning there was, but it didn't last very long, maybe 6 weeks. And then, of course, because fish is in such scarce demand, different places found different avenues for selling, and prices have just gone up and up and up and up. It's extraordinary. So I imagine that the 2020 to 2021 figures will show a complete reversal of that. It'll be interesting to see what happens when they do come out. And of course, I know a lot less about prices of fish for the big Scottish ones than I do down in the southwest. And also on note on that, for example, if you were catching a fish in Scotland, on average, it costs £1 per kilo in the southwest and only 15p in Scotland. So again, we're not maximising the economic potential of potentially our Scottish catch. It's, I would argue, too large scale, but there's got to be a middle ground somewhere, I suppose. And then you've got the UK net fish importers since 1984, and of course that's when we started to get a tasting for things like tuna and prawns and all the exotics that don't swim around these waters, and things like whiting and pouting and pollock and that sort of thing. You just don't see sold in the UK. It's very hard to access species that are landed in the Plymouth waters. A lot of these go to Spain, France, Italy, that kind of thing. So yeah, the biggest import there being tuna, but of course prawns play a big role in that too. And curiously, we import and export about the same level of farmed salmon. So Norwegian, Chilean salmon tends to be a little bit cheaper than Scottish, so you can see where that market goes as well. So that's the sort of background outlier of the way fisheries are perhaps structured at the moment. But
yeah,
quota access plays a big role as well.
Yeah, it's interesting as we look at this, because the if we were to compare the fishers, and there is of course canneries and all sorts of other things as well, but we're talking about slightly around 2 million people working in financial services as opposed to 12,000 fishers, which is a pretty interesting comparison when we look at the politics in fishing. You mentioned salmon and the imports and the exports being identical, and I saw a piece which I sent you a couple months ago in Private Eye, did I not, where you were having some problems on frozen salmon. Is that correct?
Yes, you saw me in Private Eye for all the wrong reasons, Michael. Yeah,
Oh.
Indeed. Well, yes, but that was wild salmon. So we try hard not to offer farmed fish where we can. Farmed fish, people often perhaps mistakenly think that they're doing well by the environment by switching to farmed. It couldn't be further from the truth in most cases. I mean, there are a few exceptions like mussel ranching, which is really positive for the environment. But in the most case, finfish tend to deplete natural resources rather than help protect them. And I'm going to jump from things to him, but on an interesting note, going back to the restaurant, I've seen Loch Duart prices. So Loch Duart is one of sort of the premium prices of salmon, and year on year, so April this year to last year, the price of the restaurant has gone up 72%. I mean, isn't that phenomenal? And wild salmon, while it's gone up, we were paying about £2 a pound last year. We're probably going to be paying £3 a pound this year. Wild salmon now is still not increasing. While it's increasing, still not by the potential increases that farmed is. So I just, you know, if environmental reasons aren't enough to stop using farmed species, then potentially now the economics might play into it as well. But yes, sorry, to go back to Private Eye. So this is a bit of a ludicrous case about, it's got nothing to, well, it's got everything to do with fish, but more to do with Brexit. Is that appropriate? Okay, so it's a long story, but we buy through the slow food community that I've met in Italy. We collaborate, we pull together, and we buy wild fish from Alaska from salmon fishers that we met again through the slow food connection. And to get a full container, to make the transport costs as low as you can, you need about 35 500 kilo totes on each container, on each shipping container. And we asked the broker, 35 totes, you got that? He said, yep, everything fine. Lo and behold, gets to Seattle, he can only fit 34 on the shipping vessel for whatever reason. Previous times he'd done 36, but whatever. This time we could only get 34 on. So one tote sat there in Seattle in a frozen storage from April 2021 to December 2021, where we were sending a second shipment. And we added on that old shipment, that one tote, to the additional purchases that we made in December. And it arrived in Liverpool in February. And in the time that we had bought this one tote and it set sail and reached Britain, the processing facility that it had been processed on in Seattle or in Sitka had been completely washed away in a storm. So it didn't any longer appear on the approved premises lists for the EU and for Britain. And prior to Brexit, the UK Border Patrol barely looked at this list. It just wasn't important. But for whatever reason, even though obviously US is a third party rather than an EU, they started looking at everything with more scrutiny. And they said, no, this tote is condemned. You can't import it. But it's not just the one tote that gets condemned. It's everything that sits on that health certificate in the documentation. So after battling with the Mayor of Liverpool, DEFRA, Marine Management Organisation, my local MP, Luke Pollard, who was the Shadow Fisheries Minister. I even got the US Embassy involved because they back British, American business. Still, Port Health, entity unto their own, just said, no, you have two choices, Caroline, you send it back to Alaska or you throw the whole thing away. So it's currently on its way back to Seattle, Michael. Yeah, so bit of a nightmare.
There are too many fun things in that story, sadly, if you're on the outside. If you're on the inside, I just can't imagine the frustration.
Well,
and the way,
I'm sure, I'm sure they laughed, yeah.
Now we're going to turn over a slide here, and we're going to talk a little bit about you, if you don't mind. You know, there's a lot of good things here, but I forgot to mention at the very beginning that you're dialing in here from, in fact, from Cornwall. And I hadn't picked up the irony of Luke Pollard being your local MP. I missed that one completely. But You had quite a trip around here, didn't you? You know, you're one of the very first people to discover discover sushi, I guess, in a Western sense, and then you did something with it, and now you're in Soul of Discretion, which is an amazing operation. I was just wondering if you could talk about it a little bit. I remember going to Japan to visit my sister many years ago. I think it was 1983 from memory. And we were absolutely convinced as young people that there were two things that were very interesting about Japan, but would never catch on. One was karaoke, and the other was eating raw fish. And yet you went and came up with a completely different viewpoint, and you've done a lot better on it than I have.
Yeah, well, I don't know how long you stayed, but I was there as a student for about 3 years, and I used to wake up on a Sunday morning, you know, hungover with everybody else from the karaoke bars the night before, just craving raw fish and soy sauce. It was just like, that's all I wanted to eat. I mean, forget a fried breakfast. That was what it was. And it's impossible to tell young people now. Back in the day, you couldn't get sushi. They're like, what? But yeah, now it's like, oh, shall I have sushi or shall I have an egg sandwich? It's extraordinary. I mean, I didn't foresee it going that far. I was really relying then on the Japanese banking community in the city of London, which was about 400,000 then. And I calculated that, you know, if one of them, well, 5% of them came once a week, I could open a restaurant just on that. So yeah, I was quite surprised when British people started flocking into. But yeah, it was really, and the conveyor belt sushi was the first one in Britain, and I really did that because I just thought British people like you, Michael, are not going to go for this. But if they've only spent 90p, they might give it a whirl. And because you kind of, you know, you buy with your eyes, don't you? You see it before you have to think about it. So yeah, it was fun in those days, and a conveyor belt was just unheard of, and yeah, it was just a good thing to do.
Now, Moshi Moshi meant what again? Can you remind us?
Moshi Moshi is like pronto on the telephone, so it's only on the phone. It means hello, basically. And so the Italian are the only ones that I can think of that really have a comparable word. I don't speak.
Don't want to do the Chinese, you know, way. Yeah.
Way.
And that's the name. It grew to what, 6 stores, did it? Or did it do better than
7 at one point, yeah. And then I just got, well, I don't know. I knew I didn't want to become a chain. I've never liked eating in chains myself. So that was the main premise, I think. And the second thing was not wishing to be in debt to private equity, which probably doesn't wash very well with the audience, perhaps. But I just didn't fancy that, having been in finance myself to start with. And then the third thing was, and it remains the problem, that the staff, you know, getting good sushi chefs wasn't easy then. I was going to the Philippines and Japan and getting visas to get them over. It got harder and harder. And then a fourth thing was the environmental thing, which is why I'm here really, because I had this sort of light bulb moment in 1997 where I remember going into the restaurant in Liverpool Street and I said to the chefs, guys, you know, we can't call this a Japanese restaurant. There's no bluefin on the belt. And they went, well, we did order some, Caroline, but you know, the supplier said they just didn't have any. So I ended up calling the supplier, and they said, yeah, well, we've placed orders for it, and we can't find it either. And I don't know how. I don't really remember the link then. And it was, of course, all before my ability to search on the internet. But I ended up talking to WWF, who put me in touch with Carl Safina at Monterey Bay Aquarium in California. And I remember phoning from the fax machine because that was the only telephone I had that did overseas calls. And Carl, I've got a real problem here. I run a Japanese restaurant and I really need a good source of bluefin tuna. Can you help? And there was this sort of pregnant pause on the other end of the line. And he said, now, Caroline, you wouldn't put rhinoceros on your menu, would you? I was like, oh, okay. So yeah, the penny finally dropped, but then you looked into it and you realized that actually bluefin tuna, whilst being an incredibly iconic species, and I think at that point they said it was sort of 80% stocks depleted, so only 20% of what was left 100 years ago. That was sort of the tip of the iceberg, and pretty much everything was a cascade down of what was left in the sea. And I think once you know that, you don't really want to just grow and grow and grow and grow, knowing that you're really only contributing to that problem. So I got less interested in sushi, but knowing that I keep one open so I can satiate my own needs, and got more into the fish. And then restaurants, I think if you really were keen, you could find ways of finding reasonably locally sourced fish, thanks to the likes of Jamie Oliver, Hugh Fearnley-Whittingstall. You know, the celebrity chefs, they did brilliantly for putting NGOs, fishing communities in touch with restaurants. But not so, I didn't think, for the retail consumer. So my friends would say, if I want to buy fish from a supermarket, what should I buy? And then you go back to the MSC. But for me, that didn't really cover small scale fisheries in the way that I understood was necessary for keeping coastal communities alive. It didn't really cover environmental considerations in the way I like to. So the MSC, as you probably know, Michael, looks at stock status pretty much exclusively. It doesn't look at method of catch, it doesn't look at size of boat, it doesn't look at sort of breakdown of area. It doesn't look who owns that asset. So I think it's a lot more complicated, as are most things in life. So I thought I'd get myself stuck into the complicated end of the fisheries. And so Soul of Discretion was born in 2016 to fill that gap.
I'd like to come back to certification quite quickly, but just a couple of points. I mean, one is, I must say the conveyor belt was brilliant. You copied that from Japan, did you?
Of course, yes.
Because I can tell you, when my daughters were little, we used to go to your place for sushi, and it's still in our family known as the fish train. So can we go to the fish train, Daddy? And I do recall as well one time when Elizabeth and I decided to just sit back and see how much they could eat. And it is astonishing what a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old can put away, at least if
dangerous.
It's scary.
I always feel mildly sorry looking at parents with their children at the conveyor belt, because I know just how much those plates can stack up. So yeah, apologies, Michael.
And in doing research for this program, which is another way of saying walking to work, I passed by Liverpool Street the other day and I saw Moshi Moshi is still there. Are you still involved with that one?
Yes, I still own that. Yep.
Okay,
yep.
Cool.
That's the only one left though. So all the rest have gone. It's just that one.
All right, well, this is my ask to the audience. If you're near Liverpool Street and want sushi, go to Caroline's place. It's just behind the back of it all. Now, as we move on to sustainability, got some questions in here from the audience I'd like to feed in. And Bob McDowell is kind of curious. He's saying, well, does the UK public need education in the variety and versatility of fish cuisine? You know, many people are so moronic gastronomically that their knowledge does not extend much beyond cod, salmon, and haddock. Any thoughts on that?
Totally. And, you know, if you're asking me what would be my asks, one of them, because I had 3, I'm afraid, Michael, but one of them would be to get off this top 5. So 80% of what we eat in Britain are salmon, cod, haddock, tuna, and prawns, of which we only really produce the cod and the haddock. The rest is always imported or semi-imported. So, yeah, I mean, we see quite regularly 50-odd species landed on the market down in Plymouth every day. And as I say, most of them used to go to Spain and Italy because they pay more for them. So I think it does feed into this whole question of the economies of scale. So whilst you can catch pelagic haddock and cod in fairly large numbers while stocks last, you simply struggle to do that for some of the flatter fish or the smaller species like red mullet or gurnard. They just don't mass in those numbers. So it doesn't fit very neatly into the supply chain of the dominant supermarket trade. You know, supermarkets don't want two gurnards, 1 red mullet and 100 kilos of cod. They want 100 of each. Nature just doesn't deliver like that. So you have to look outside of the supermarkets, I think, for it, which is a problem. But yeah, educating people to be a bit braver would. I mean, I feel that the chefs do that pretty well, though. Hugh Fearnley-Whittingstall really did well on it. So did Jamie Oliver. Rick Stein, brilliant. So there is the education there. I think that the information's out there. I think people just fall onto.
Okay. Well done, Bob. You nailed one of Caroline's asks with a dare to the audience. Can you find her other 2? But just quickly, Caroline, Bob goes on. He's kind of curious. Could the UK make more of its fish industry by extending things like smoking and drying, more imaginative forms of fish processing, spices, other forms of preservative. Any thoughts there? Are we boring, or are we doing most of that?
Again, I think in the last 5 to maybe even 10 years, a lot more artisanal smokers have come into play. So that's been great. In the southwest down here, there are a lot of small brands that have popped up, just as you've seen for bakeries or cheese makers, that kind of stuff. So things have moved on there, probably not as much as they should. But then again, you know, the foreign markets have to date paid more for their fish than we have wanted to. So automatically they've gone overseas, and you tend to smoke things when you want to prolong its shelf life, or you don't have an outlet for it. And up until now, well, even now, demand generally outstrips supply, which is why fish prices are relentlessly higher and higher. So is there the need for the smoking? I mean, we get round with not wanting to waste anything by freezing everything. If we haven't sold it on the day we've landed it, it gets put into the freezer. I'd sooner it go to a smoker or a freezer than get wasted, obviously. So there are obviously things we can do there. But we also don't eat much fish, which is something that, yeah, we'll learn more about soon.
All right. Yeah, and in fact, if these prices keep rising, maybe we'll overtake the lawnmower industry. Who knows? So that's a good thing, isn't it? But let's talk just a minute. You know, kind of give us a 60-second promo for Soul of Discretion, because with this career where you know so much, where you're very concerned about environmentalism and the supply, you've now set up 6 years ago this wonderful brand and this wonderful supplier of fish. So just what are the special aspects about Soul of Discretion?
Well, its first one was, if you want to, I mean, I came into it trying to protect the environment rather than the fishing community, although they have subsequently said, Caroline, we're more endangered than the fish. Small scale fishers are going by the wayside, as are the farming community. We all know that the farming community is getting older, fishers are too. And I think they'll get to a point where perhaps 10 years from now we go, oh yeah, you know what, these small boats actually were more fuel efficient. I mean, who knew that, huh? More fuel efficient from small over large. That was news to me a few years ago. They do catch a variety of species, and much more than we thought they did. Perhaps we should go back to these small scale guys, and we go back to them, but they're not there any longer. They've just lost their livelihood because it's become so difficult. So part of it was to really support them in their endeavors to carry on fishing. So we're a community interest company, so it's owned by the fishing community that land to us. They are exclusively under 10 meters, and everybody takes the mick out of me on the fish pee. Oh, you only buy from the virgins, Caroline. It's like, I know I'm not born yesterday that no fisher out there isn't a pirate, but at least the worst of my pirates can't do the damage to the environment that the best of some of the industrial trawls can. So it's keeping the livelihoods going of these small scale fishers, and helping consumers put, if they care about the environment and potentially the social impact, giving the consumer the ability to say, yep, I want to eat fish, but I know that I want to do as least damage to as possible. And on each of our packs, we put the method of catch and the boat name, so we trace right back to the boat. And as far as I know, that's still a first. I don't think anybody's yet copied us on that, because it's a labor of love. You know, you get 2 kilos of that and 10 of that sometimes. That's a lot of manual changes on your labels. And to this end, we're working with the Soil Association, which are the big certifier of organic farming, to help get a consumer recognized logo, for the want of a better word, that will differentiate industrial trawl from small scale, so that can become something that perhaps the consumer can push government into making changes to its legislation when they see that the public understand the difference between small and industrial, which up until now they've largely been prevented from learning about because industry doesn't want it to happen. When the consumer is pushing policy, perhaps that's when government will start giving better access to small scale fishers.
Now, you and I share quite a passion. In fact, Zien as a whole shares a passion with you on environmental, particularly maritime environmental, marine environment, where, in fact, our book, The Price of Fish, was partially based on our experiences helping to establish the Marine Stewardship Council, and we could chat about that for hours. So there's a lot in common that we have here, but the audience is kind of curious about your thoughts on some of this. We've been using technology at Zien, for example, with Malcolm McGarvin, who's been with his fish face movement. He's been using one of our blockchains to actually track through the supply chain, and I hasten to add, for several years now. This isn't a recent thing. But Clive Bullen is curious. Are we in danger of running out of particular varieties of UK fish? Is there something imminent that you can see?
I mean, we're in danger of running out of most things without sounding too alarmist if we carry on catching at the rate we are, and I can talk a bit about Brexit into that as well. But a classic example would be cuttlefish. So I work with a fisher in Eastbourne who pretty much spearheaded the cuttlefish pot trap fishery. So it's caught in something that looks like a lobster pot. Minimal environmental impact on the ground. Cuttlefish only live for 2 years and they only breed in the 2nd year. And the way they were caught is you put a male in the pot. Sorry, you do it the other way around, don't you? You put a female in the pot and the males all come in. So you knew you were only catching the larger ones. He also left pots and substrate on the bottom of the sea where they could lay their eggs, and it was a really successful fishery that he built. It was only a short fishery, it lasted from April to June, but he built pretty much most of his livelihood for 35 years fishing on this cuttlefish trap. And then there was some virus that went round in the Pacific in the squid fishery about 4 years ago, and it put the price of squid right up. So people started focusing on the cuttlefish industry here. It's like, oh, people want to eat cuttlefish now. They hadn't touched it. It was just an untapped fishery of the UK boats. And all of a sudden, I mean, fishers in Brixham have been dubbed, it was called the black gold. They made hundreds of thousands, they bought nice cars and houses in one season from this black gold. The price sort of trebled. And it was rated by the Marine Conservation Society 1, 2, 4 years ago. It's just been put on the red list, 4, 5, I don't know how, no, 5, sorry, so the worst, in danger of collapse, in the space of just 3 years, because this fish only has a lifespan of 2 years. If you heavily fish it for 2 years, there's nothing to return on year 3, and that's what we're seeing now. It's all but gone. So yeah, there are plenty of examples of that, sadly.
I've got quite a few questions here. Peter's going to rack up another poll for the audience while I ask one to you. An interesting one here, really from Donald McCrae, and related oddly to a point Bob McDowell made. Bob McDowell sort of, why is fishing such an emotional subject when compared with potatoes or strawberries? But Donald McCrae's here. Can you explain, Caroline, why the fishing industry were largely pro-Brexit? The CFP conserves stocks in contrast to the actions of the UK operators who sold their quotas to EU operators who took a much longer term strategic view rather than trying to maximize returns in the short term. While I've read that out to you and you're thinking about it, just folks, please answer the question here in the quick poll. Is UK per capita fish consumption at 152.8 grams per person per week closest to Iceland, known heavy fish consumers, Russia, Cuba, Turkey, or Portugal? As Caroline said earlier, it's interesting where we stand on that. And while you're answering that poll, we've got, over the audience voted. Peter, do you want to go ahead and display the results, which are fairly conclusive, with 53% of the audience opting for Turkey. And now in the way that we're doing these today, the reveal, Peter, if you don't mind. Ta-da! It was Russia at 20.7 kilograms per year. Interesting, I found pulling this together. I had no idea the Turks ate so little fish. But we are not up there in the heavy charts, are we? We are, in fact, slightly below the worldwide average. But going back to the question from Donald McCrae, why were the fishing industry so pro-Brexit?
I honestly don't know, and I almost got into fisticuffs with the people that organised the Plymouth auction down here. They're such good people, and yeah, they were quite angry with me for being anti-Brexit. I was such a lone voice down here. I mean, I can only say that I think it's because most of them didn't. I mean, it's extraordinary not to understand your own industry, although I did it for years in banking. They believed somehow it was the EU that dealt them the poor, particularly the small scale vessels, and it absolutely wasn't. So the EU gives Britain its quota, and it's up to Britain how we share it out amongst our fishermen. And it was Britain that decided that the small scale fishers only get 2% of the entire quota. So if you remember that first slide we were looking at that was saying 61% of all vessels are under 10 meters, and in England actually that goes up to closer to 75%. Of those 75% of vessels, they only get 2% of quota. So they assumed that this was the EU giving them this bad deal, where it absolutely wasn't. So that's point one. It's like, you know, don't listen to hearsay on the market, just go out and find the facts. And then the second reason I think was there was a sort of assumption, and I, you know, even I dared hope this, that we would automatically default to the 12-mile nautical limit, which is our sovereign right. And it kind of didn't occur to me, whilst they kept saying, oh, we're negotiating for the fisheries, that wasn't a line in the sand. Because they kept saying, you know, the fisheries are so important to us, we were all lulled into this full sense of security that 12-mile would stand, but absolutely not. And of late, because of the distribution of fisheries quota post-Brexit, a lot of the big Belgium and French and Dutch boats, they're called fly shooters, are coming to the 6 nautical mile limit, and they're putting these massive gears into the water. I mean, something that we've not seen before Brexit. And they must be doing something wrong, because as soon as we send one of the 2 patrol boats that do the south coast out, they all scooter away. So they know they're doing, you know, something must not be going right there. But they know they can get away with it. They're inside the 6-mile limit. It means that a lot of our fishers that have got static gear, it's like a big tennis net in the sea, can only go to the 6-mile limit, because of course if they leave the net beyond that, they're in danger of losing their gear, and you know, they've got to replace the nets, and it's a wasted trip. So it limits their access to the fisheries. And there was this big thing, and apparently everybody thought that finance would be given a good deal, but you weren't either, which is extraordinary. But in the fisheries, the headline figure was that we were getting 25% uplift on our quota, but it wasn't 25% of what we catch, or of the quota. It was 25% of what the EU has in our waters of their quota.
Yeah, yeah.
So 5% it amounted to just an 8.3% uplift in quota. So all this for an extra 8.3% of quota. It's madness. I don't think anybody's celebrating it any longer, except that fish prices have gone up. Is that Brexit related? I don't know.
Now, we've pulled forward this slide. I asked you for a slide you thought was really telling, and this is showing the global situation, isn't it? So these are worldwide figures. Do you just want to talk the audience through 1 or 2 key points on this they might want to take away?
Well, I'll talk to, yeah. So if you look at the top one there, it's large scale. This is worldwide figures, as you say, large scale versus small, and 60 million tons landed by the large boats, 30 or close to 30 by the small. If you discount the discards at sea, so the fish that basically get thrown back into the sea dead, which the large scale vessels do and the small don't, and you discount the fish meal fish that go into biodiesel fuel or fish meal or whatever, actually in terms of human consumption, the small scale vessels can actually supply as much to the industry as large scale can. And I was always told by critics of what we're trying to do here, oh, Caroline, you're hippy dippy thinking, small scale vessels can never supply the demand that's out there. But globally, it looks like they can. We just have to reorganize the economics and the distribution. And then, of course, the fuel has become really important. I only learnt this relatively recently, that for every kilo of fish, you need up to 5 litres of fuel for 1 kilo of fish. I mean, it's just like mind-blowing statistics. And it's worse in the big scale than the small. And I'd always assumed that there must be some economies of scale going for the bigger vessels, but apparently not. And this is Daniel Pauly's research. He's a real top professor in British Columbia on marine issues. The MSc saw this and can't argue with Daniel Pauly. And then you've got that multiplier effect of the numbers employed in the fisheries. So large versus small is much better for the coastal communities here. And then the subsidies through the fuel as well. The taxpayers are effectively subsidizing bad, environmentally damaging fisheries. I shouldn't say bad, I will say environmentally less good fisheries. But now, this one slide says it all for me.
And we're going to have to close soon, but just wanted to pick up on a couple of questions. You could do it quickly. Tim Connell, curious, any comments you'd like to make comparing shellfish with the offshore and pelagic?
Of course, the Scottish rely very heavily on the shellfish, and they've done pretty well from that. There are vessels down here that are effectively pressure washing the seabed at the moment.
Okay. And
down here, pressure moment again for vessels on the 6 nautical mile limit to get shellfish up. This type of fishery can't exist. It can't continue, I should say. Sorry. Yep.
Very good. Question here from Graham Elliott. I'm not quite sure what Graham's driving at, but he's asking, should the UK industry promote fish soup for home consumption?
I think that's a fantastic and really tasty bones. Why not? I think we've all got to become better cooks though, Michael. And if my cooking's anything to go by, a fish fillet is so easy. You just open the packet, salt, pepper it, grill it for 5 minutes, and you've got a supper. That's the kind of food I can cook.
Good. And the last question from the audience before I try and wrap up with a couple for you. It's from Andrew Ross, and you'd expect this from a financial services audience. What do you think of the idea of marine protected areas, which might enable something like a blue bond to be issued? Any thoughts on that?
So generally it sounds wonderful, and generally it probably is wonderful. But for example, in the marine protected areas up in Shetland, dredge scallops are still allowed. So I think you've got to really look into the detail of what's allowable in some of these marine protected areas. And I would say with the offshore ones, again, I would never want to see small scale local fishermen displaced because their livelihoods go. And I've seen that happening in Mauritania, not because of MPAs being created, but because of industrial fish meal vessels coming in. And these guys end up on ships coming from Libya to Sicily looking for economic benefits in Europe. So don't displace small scale fishers in the process of creating these MPAs. They can both work together.
Okay. And I can't resist a comment. Hugh Purser is, I think, trying to support the Ukraine. He's asking Yen to set up departments for blue fintech and yellow fintech, but let's not go there. Right. Now, Caroline, just to move on, broadly, one blunt question. Are you optimistic, pessimistic, or undecided about the outlook for fish in the UK?
Oh, I have to stay on the middle thing. I think if I look at all the science and I look at all the way the fisheries are run and I look at the black landings quite frequently on the fish quay next to me, it's very hard to be hopeful. But yeah, you have to start and do with what you can do. And I think if the awareness builds and actually all food is becoming more expensive, fish will become comparatively less expensive, and therefore perhaps it has hope.
Good. And our final one, your 3 asks to our audience. So one was be more.
Well, one was, just get off the top 5, salmon, tuna, prawn. One is consider eating wild over farmed. People think that they're helping the environment by eating farmed. It couldn't be further from the truth. And the second for the finance industry, and I know this is hard because small scale always means nitty griddly, picking at the margins. And it's hard to find a a financial model that works for them. But what we're looking to do with the Soil Association is put all the small scale vessels under an umbrella organization. So perhaps look at financing something that helps identify small scale from industrial, and that in turn allows the consumer to put their money into less damaging local fisheries. Perhaps that's a start point.
Well, Caroline, it has been fascinating. I must say, I took away, I think it's a natural tendency of many of us in finance to assume that bigger is better. And I do mean better in an efficiency sense, just that, and those numbers in particular about the energy consumption is going to have to be addressed for all sorts of other reasons as well. I'm so appreciative. I mean, it's great to have on CommunityZ Chest somebody who's running a community interest company, which is good for us. And we really appreciate you taking the time and the effort to talk to a slightly different audience you might otherwise encounter, but sharing your experiences along a very long road of both fish and sustainability. And we admire your work, and we're delighted you took the time to feature it with us here today. Unfortunately, my trip to the Far East brought me back some new technology as well. And I have here the only thing I can do by way of automated applause in our new online systems, and that's to use my Korean karmic clapper to thank you very much for coming. And we hope to hear many great things about solar discretion as it progresses.
That was the best clap I've ever heard. And it was my pleasure, Michael. Thanks very much.